Good morning, everyone, and thank you all for joining the meeting to discuss the draft final proposal for the EIM SubEntity Scheduling Coordinator Initiative. This is Christina Osborne. I'll be facilitating the meeting. So this graphic depicts ISO stakeholder process. We are in the draft final proposal phase, and we are going to be starting the tariff development phase soon, and I will go into the details for that schedule at the end of the presentation. So Danny Johnson is the policy lead for this initiative. He's going to provide an overview of the stakeholder comments that we received on the revised draw proposal and also discuss the changes resulting from those comments, and then he'll go into the details of the draft final proposal, and at the end I'll go over the EIM classification and next steps. We are going to take questions throughout the presentation. So when we do pause for questions, we'll instruct you on how to raise your hand to enter the queue. We just ask that you start by providing your name and affiliation. We are recording the meeting. We will make the video file available on the initiative webpage for a limited time. Just as a reminder, please request permission from the ISO before reprinting or sharing any related transcriptions. We do have other ISO subject matter experts who have been involved in this effort who are on the phone line. We have Brad Cooper, we have Rebecca Webb, as well as Putha Dahlia, and we may have others join after we kick off the meeting. So with that, I will go ahead and turn the meeting over to Danny Johnson.
Thanks, Christina. So we're going to start off reviewing the stakeholder comments we received to the revised draw proposal we put out, or to the draft final proposal we put out, and then giving an overview of any changes we have made to the proposal in consideration of those comments. So can we move to the next slide? So the first item was stakeholders requested additional clarification on the types of entities that qualify as an EIM subentity due to regional differences. Essentially, we put forth in the revised draw proposal what we thought were reasonable expectations for trying to pursue this functionality, but due to some differences in the way LSEs participate within their BAAs regionally, we got requests for clarification. The first one would be to clarify that an electric utility embedded within an EIM entity balancing authority area and not receiving long-term wholesale full requirements from the EIM entity, so partial requirement, or LSEs receiving partial requirements could pursue this functionality. The second change was to clarify that an entity who's operating a distribution system or transmission facilities directly connected to the transmission system of the EIM entity for the purpose of serving eligible customers in its capacity as a local publicly owned utility would also be eligible to pursue this type of functionality. The next request we got was for an example of how the over and under scheduling assessment would be performed. So this is lifted directly out of the draft final proposal. What I'd like to point your attention to is how the impact or how the ability of a subentity or the base schedule submitted by a subentity have the ability to impact how this assessment would be performed on the entire EIM balancing authority area. So the first point would be that the over and under scheduling assessment would be performed if the forecast requirement is exceeded by 1%. As you could see, this example, that first 356 highlighted in red is 5 megawatts. This is greater than 1% of the forecast. Should something like this occur, then the actual test would be applied. The UIE quantity that was metered is in excess of 5% of the hourly base schedule. So in this case, the 25% penalty would be applied to all metered demand, which you see reflected in the 3 columns to the right. So it's just, again, I want to reiterate that the ability of one EIM subentity has the ability to affect how this is assessed for the entire balancing authority area, and that really informs why we are choosing to give the authority to the EIM entity to allow subentities to, or they have the authority to dictate the forecasting that subentities use for this reason. I think we can stop and see if we have any questions on the first two slides. Do we have any questions?
Sure. So to raise your hand, press pound 2 on your telephone keypad, and please name and affiliation first. Ethan, let me know if anybody enters the queue.
All right, we do have one question in the queue so far. I'll go ahead and put them through now. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Kathy Sabers from Black Hills, and we're within the PSCO BA. Could you, let's quickly, because we'll pass that last slide a little quick with the proposed clarifications with who, yes, that one.
Yeah, so the changes are the bolded text.
Right. Yeah, we would probably have some follow-up questions on this, especially with the directly connected language. I would need to follow up with my team because I'm actually covering for someone today, so I apologize that I'm a little bit new to this, but that could cause us some concern.
That you would not be able to participate as a sub-entity due to this language?
Yes.
So this is only a portion of the sub-entity eligibility language. In the actual proposal, we have the full slate of language. So
got it.
If you want to, yeah, okay, we'll just see if that alleviates your concern when we get to that slide.
Yep, that'd be great. Thank you.
Ethan, do we have anybody else in the queue?
There are no further hands raised in the queue at this time.
Okay, and I also just wanted to mention, I forgot to introduce James Lynn, who is also on the call, who's been involved in this effort. So, Danny, go ahead. We'll go to slide 7.
Yeah. So stakeholders requested clarification on when EIM entities can make changes to an EIM sub-entity base schedule or manually dispatch resources that a sub-entity is registered as the scheduling coordinator for. The draft final proposal chooses not to put bounds on these actions as we think they are part of the EIM entity's BAA operator role. We don't want to take away any of the tools they have available to perform that role. Additionally, any criterion for or financial results of these actions should be agreed upon and specified in the appropriate entity's tariff or any applicable agreement. We don't plan to dictate in this policy how any financial changes, if should either of these items occur, be allocated. So stakeholders requested additional detail on how price formation will be performed for EIM sub-entities. Each EIM sub-entity will receive their own customized load aggregation point for determining their aggregated pricing node. The implications for other load-serving entities within the EIM entity when this occurs should be considered by the BAA as part of the decision to pursue and grant sub-entity functionality to that LSE. We would note that this should not result in any cost shifting between BAAs. The final change that we really spilled a lot of ink on in the draft final proposal is our proposal to charge EIM sub-entities the costs associated with onboarding. The sub-entity onboarding will follow a modified version of the existing CAISO EIM onboarding process. We have some slides on this later in the presentation, but we would note that the cost can vary significantly depending upon if the EIM sub-entity is inside of a BAA that's already participating in the EIM, as well as the level of independence that EIM entity would give the sub-entity with respect to the full network model submission, the forecasting, and the outage submission. I think that's the last of the stakeholder comments and changes slides, so we can stop again for questions.
Sure. You can press pound 2 to raise your hand.
All right, we do have a hand raised in the queue. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
caller, you may have to unmute your phone.
Hey, Danny, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Danny, this is Caleb Brumhall, Pot River Power Authority, and I just wanted to double check. It appeared to us as we looked at kind of the changes that were done for costs for onboarding that this was in anticipation for kind of future onboarding efforts. Does CalISO anticipate that this will impact the current implementation that's ongoing with the PSCO BAA?
No. Thank you for helping to clarify that, Caleb. These costs are for future onboarding. I think we actually have a footnote in the draft final proposal that calls out that the implementation costs of already agreed upon EIM implementation agreements are separate from this, since those agreements already contemplated the nuances of onboarding, for say, the JDA parties.
Awesome. Thank you.
Any other questions, Lisa?
We have one other question in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put them through now. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Callie Wells with WPTF. I have a quick question on slide 8 when you were talking about price formation. Excuse me. So I get that it wouldn't result in any cost shifting between BAAs, but would it result in cost shifting between entities within an EIM BAA that now has maybe one entity choosing a CLAP and the others not?
Kelly, I think the answer to that is it would have the potential to cause that, but that decision has to be signed off on by the EIM entity itself.
Okay, so when they're making the decision on whether or not they will allow sub-entities, that's something that they would potentially consider.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Any other questions, Ethan?
There are no further questions in the queue at this time.
All right.
Okay, so I'm going to move on to the draft final proposal section. Again, I'll stop a few times for questions at strategic stopping points. This should look fairly familiar to anybody who participated in the last call, since the changes, as we just went over, are fairly minor to the draft final proposal, but again, we'll review everything. So the CAISO proposes that an EIM SubEntity Scheduling Coordinator must be an electric utility embedded within an EIM BAA and not receive wholesale full requirements for service from the EIM entity, own a distribution system or transmission facilities directly connected to the transmission system of the EIM entity for the purpose of either A, providing regulated electric service to eligible retail or wholesale customers, or B, serving eligible customers in its capacity as a local publicly owned electric utility, and own or control one or more resources for the primary purpose of serving its eligible customers. So again, this is the full slate of eligibility requirements that we talked about, I think in slide 5. They're just included here. So the change would be full, and then that clause B in the second bullet. Second, should a subentity meet all these, the EIM entity can elect to allow any of the following. They can allow no subentities within their balancing authority area. This could be due to the financial or operational burden that supporting subentities would place on the EIM entity. They could choose to allow all entities within their control area to pursue subentity functionality, or they could choose to allow entities that meet the CAISO definition of a subentity that have existing contractual or tariff-based practices for accounting for imbalance energy that is unique among its transmission service customers. I think a general example of this would be any transmission service customer that has grandfathered agreements with the EIM entity that are different from the standard transmission service they provide. I think we can stop and see if we have any questions.
Ethan, do we have anybody in the queue? Again, press pound 2.
At this time, I see no hands raised.
Give it a moment.
At this time, there are still no hands raised in the queue.
Thanks, Ethan.
Okay, great. So moving on to the resource sufficiency evaluation, we propose to continue to perform this at the balancing authority area level. Ensuring supply and load balance is a BAA function. Again, the results of the resource sufficiency evaluation can determine the entire BAA's ability to access incremental upward EIM transfers. The EIM subentity scheduling coordinators will be able to submit base schedules prior to the T55 RSE deadline. The exact timing of this should be specified in the EIM entity's OAT. After this, the EIM entity will retain the ability to make changes to those schedules prior to the final binding deadline, which right now is at T40 to the hour. Again, any financial results of these actions should be specified in the appropriate entity's tariff or applicable agreements. Next slide. For the full network model, the draft final proposal proposes that the network model submission remain the responsibility of the EIM entity. We would like to give the EIM entity optionality to allow a subentity to submit its own network model directly to the CAISO. The EIM subentity will be responsible for providing any network model changes to both the EIM entity and the CAISO. All resources the EIM subentity is functioning as the participating scheduling coordinator for must be included in the model. This is a change that we made, a very minor change in response to one of the comments we received. We got a request for clarification that all resources there, that the SC4 are represented in the model. This seemed reasonable, so we went ahead and added it. And then finally, all model submissions are subject to the already established CAISO full network model updating process. For dispatch options, we have two different tranches here. The first would be how the automated dispatch system works. The CAISO proposes the automated dispatch system will continue to communicate resource-specific dispatch information. This information will be available to both the EIM subentity as well as the EIM entity itself. Regarding manual dispatch, the CAISO proposes both an EIM subentity and an EIM entity will have the ability to perform manual dispatch. Again, any criterion for or financial results of these actions should be specified in the appropriate entity's tariff or applicable agreements. On the manual dispatch, our reasoning was that we again don't want to take away a BAA's ability to perform manual dispatch if they need to in their balancing function. While an EIM subentity could choose to manually dispatch as part of a reserve sharing agreement was a request we heard. So I think we can pause there. Yeah, thanks, Christina.
Sure. So do we have anybody in the queue, Ethan?
Once again, you can enter the queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad, but at this time, I see no hands raised in the queue.
Okay,
great. We can move forward. Moving on to forecasting. For supply, this should be the same as the revised draft proposal. The CAISO proposes that an EIM entity retain the ability to require an EIM subentity to use the CAISO-provided forecast or allow the subentity to use its own forecast. The CAISO proposes to provide the ability for the EIM entity to view in some format the forecast of all the variable energy resources within its BAA, and forecasts used in the RSE will be locked at T55 as is currently implemented. On the second bullet, we got a request to provide an example of what this user interface would look like. We didn't think that was appropriate in the policy development section. I think that should come out of the business requirement development section of this functionality. For forecasting of load, the CAISO proposal allows EIM entities to determine if they will be responsible for the load forecast for their entire area, or if they will allow the EIM subentities to determine their own load forecast. if any EIM subentity within a balancing authority area elects to submit its own load forecast, the entire balancing authority area will automatically be subject to the over and under scheduling evaluation. This ties back to that example we had on slide 6. In that example, that 1% threshold had to be exceeded before the over-under scheduling evaluation was performed. Should a subentity elect to submit its own forecast, then that evaluation would be performed on the entire BAA regardless, so we thought it would be appropriate to allow the EIM entity to retain the authority to decide if a subentity could submit their own forecast. Next slide. So I think I kind of got a little out over my skis because this is the over and under scheduling slide. So the CAISO proposes that over and under scheduling assessment is determined based on the net BAA load deviation. It's performed again at the BAA level while the penalties are assessed at the EIM subentity level. Then EIM subentities will be allocated a portion of the overscheduling and underscheduling total costs based on the meter demand within the subentity and the subentity submitted base schedule. This tracks with that example that we went over and the example provided within the paper.
Okay, Ethan, do we have anybody in the queue? Again, press pound 2.
I'll go ahead and give it a moment.
Thank you.
There are no hands raised in the queue at this time.
Okay, thank you.
The next topic is bid cost recovery, real-time offset, and flexible ramp movement. The CAISO proposes to continue allocating BCR charges and real-time offset charges at the EIM entity level with sub-allocations to the EIM subentity scheduling coordinators performed per the EIM entity's OAT. These charges are calculated at the BAA level, which is why we are continuing to give them to the EIM entity to determine further OAT. The CAISO proposes the flexible ramp movement allocation and flexible ramp uncertainty allocation will be settled at the EIM subentity level for resources the subentity is serving as the scheduling coordinator for. This is due to these charges being calculated at a resource level, so we're able to directly settle these with the scheduling coordinator for those resources. Next slide. For invoicing, the CAISO proposes the EIM entity shall have the ability to access the EIM entity statements, invoices, as well as all EIM subentity statements and invoices for subentities within their balancing authority area. The EIM subentity is only able to access their own statement. The EIM subentity will be invoiced based upon the settlement of the resources associated with the subentity, which is pretty common sense, but we thought we'd state this anyway. For energy transfers, the CAISO proposes to continue to only model energy transfers at the balancing authority area level. Only EIM entities are able to submit transfer-based schedules. Further explicitly modeling intra-BAA energy transfers is not consistent with the way the CAISO markets model. So this is only between BAA, it's a BAA to BAA transfer. Interchange between subentities and external parties will be reflected in the EIM entity scheduling coordinator's base schedule. This ensures that the EIM entity retains the ability to resolve overscheduling on any intertie. For outage management, we have a couple slides. The CAISO proposes that EIM entities and subentities will submit outages using the CAISO's WebOMS application. All EIM entity and subentities that are RC West member will submit outages per RC 0320. This is the existing outage coordination procedure for RC West. For EIM entities or EIM subentities that are not RC West participants, the EIM entity scheduling coordinator will remain responsible for the submission of all generation outages in their area. However, they will have the option to delegate this authority to subentities. We're configuring this functionality that if they give the subentity the option to submit outages, they would still be able to view these outages. the EIM SubEntity scheduling coordinators will submit to the CAISO transmission outages for equipment they are the transmission operator for. Next slide. With receiving outages from EIM subentities that are not members of RCOS, the CAISO will propose to block outage data from neighboring reliability coordinators for these subentity participants. The EIM entity and the EIM subentities are responsible for ensuring that outages submitted to the CAISO and the neighboring RCs are consistent for reliability purposes. And then the EIM outage submission process does not replace the BAA and transmission operator coordination required by neighboring reliability coordinator areas.
Danny, let's stop for questions, see if anybody's in next.
Yeah, sure.
So again, if you have a question, press pound 2.
At this time, I'm still seeing no hands raised in the queue.
All right, thank you.
This was the subentity onboarding for future subentities was a topic that we expanded quite a bit in the draft final proposal. We put some bounds around the sequencing of this and the costs that we would, and then the projected costs of subentity onboarding. So should an entity elect to pursue EIM subentity functionality, they must notify the CAISO that they've been authorized by their EIM entity, they meet the qualifications for participation as an EIM subentity, and that they have executed the applicable pro forma service agreements. At the conclusion of that, the CAISO will give them an implementation date between 12 and 24 months. This will be determined upon the complexity and compatibility of the associated transmission and technology systems. This gets back to, is the subentity embedded in a EIM entity that's already, or a balancing authority area that's already an EIM participant? Is this brand new? And then the ability or the amount of independence that that subentity is granted by the EIM entity. Next slide. So we are proposing to charge new EIM subentities for their implementations at cost of service. We went and did a preliminary projection of what we think onboarding a subentity would cost, and the low end would be $216,000 and the high end would be $304,000, again, depending upon the complexity of onboarding. The CAISO proposes to require a deposit of $260,000 and additional incremental deposits of $25,000 should the initial deposit be exceeded. At the conclusion of the project, the CAISO proposes to provide a detailed documentation of all the costs incurred and return any unused funds. Additionally, should a EIM subentity agreement be terminated during the process of onboarding, the CAISO would move to immediately stop all work on the subentity and then return any unused funds that we can, or that are still, any funds that are still unused. So for the actual onboarding process, the CAISO proposes using 6 distinct work streams. These are based upon the EIM onboarding right now that we have for EIM entities. However, they will be modified as necessary depending upon the scope of the implementation. Next slide.
I think that's it, Danny.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so then I guess we can pause one more time and see if we have any questions.
Sure. Again, press pound 2 to raise your hand.
We do have 2 questions in the queue at this time. I'll go ahead and put the first caller through. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Danny. Dan Williams from Customized Energy Solutions. Just a question on those costs. Is it currently practice that a new EIM entity would be sub-allocating just sort of its standard startup costs to among its measured demand or customers?
I am not sure on that. I'd like to turn to the other panelists and see if anybody knows how we currently or how EIM entities may allocate their costs. James, I heard you speaking.
James Wood. Yeah, I was going to say, this is James. It's based upon their individual oaths, but I am aware that a lot of the oaths are coming in alignment. So a lot of them are allocating it to measure demand. But again, it goes back to what is it within the BAA's open access transition tariff, and whether or not they've added to do it to measure demand or some other methodology.
Okay, so end result then I'm taking could be that if you had, say, a brand new entity coming in with a sub-entity, that sub-entity may be responsible for this incremental piece to the CAISO as well as some allocation of the overall startup costs from their EIM entity. Is that kind of a rational thought subject to the oath provisions?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Just wanted to kind of check the thinking on that. Thanks.
All right. Moving on to our next caller. Caller, you are now unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, this is Dan Walter at Tri-State. I'm looking at the work streams that you're proposing for onboarding. How do these compare with the work streams we're currently doing for just a participating resource?
I'm not sure if somebody's trying to respond. You might have your phone muted.
Yeah, this is Danny. I think that they would be a little bit more comprehensive than just for a participating resource, but it is some similar work.
Yeah. So this is James Lynn. So all of the most of the work stream is similar. It's just the level of effort required to bring on an individual generator versus carving out or modeling a new load area within the BAA. It does require some additional efforts in these areas. It also depends upon whether or not you're onboarding in an EIM area that's already in the participating in the market versus onboarding with an EIM area that's coming on brand new.
All right, thank you.
All right, any other questions, Ethan?
We have no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay. All right, so that's what we have for the draft final proposal. So as far as the EIM classification, we do believe that this falls within the EIM governing body's primary authority of approval of the proposed changes. So this initiative satisfies both tests. Tariff rules to create a new type of scheduling coordinator role would be EIM specific because it would be available only to represent market participants within the EIM entities, BAAs, and not across the entire market footprint. In addition, the primary driver for addressing this topic is to resolve an issue that is specific to one EIM balancing authority area. So based on the comments that we received on our previous proposal, stakeholders did agree that this is the appropriate classification for this initiative. This is the remainder of the stakeholder process schedule. This is for the proposal and the tariff development. And so we are asking for stakeholders to submit written comments on our draft final proposal. Those are going to be due April 9th. We do have a comment template available on the initiative webpage, so please use that when submitting your comments. We are going to be kicking off the draft tariff language process that will begin April 13th. We will post the tariff language. We'll ask for stakeholders to submit comments before the call. Those will be due April 27th. We'll have a call on May 5th to review the red line tariff as well as the comments that we received. The plan is to take the proposal to the EIM governing body on May 6th for primary for approval, and then we'll, in between the EIM governing body in the board meeting will post revised draft tariff language. Then the board meeting is on the 19th and 20th. Comments on the revised draft tariff language due the 21st, and then followed by a call on the 27th. So the dates that have the asterisk are tentative. Once those details have been confirmed, we do issue a public notice with the information. So do we have any other questions? Again, press pound 2 to raise your hand. For any comments from ISO staff.
We do have a question that just popped up in the queue, 2 in fact. Would you like me to go ahead with the callers?
Please, thank you.
First call, you have been unmuted. Please go ahead.
This is Dan Walter at Tri-State again, and I apologize if this question has already been asked, but related to sub-entities and their responsibilities. Tri-State, for instance, is a transmission owner and a transmission provider and customer within the PSCO BA. I'll just throw out a hypothetical. If Tri-State was to become a sub-entity and it provides network service and has some non-Tri-State, non-participating load and or resources that it provides service to, would that non-participating load, non-participating resource be part of our sub-entity, or would it be extracted and part of the EIM entity?
If, to the extent that you're providing service for it, I think that we would try to keep it within your sub-entity, modeling-wise.
All right. That could get a little confusing. I'm just thinking the PSCO example, because Tri-State's also we're network customers of, for instance, Black Hills and Platte River and PSCO, and we are a network provider to an entity that is none of those, and then trying to potentially taking this new tariff service under 3 or 4 different tariffs would be interesting. I'm just observing, but thanks for the opinion.
Ethan, did you say we had another question in the queue?
Yes, we do. I'll go ahead and put them through now. Caller, you are unmuted. Please go ahead. Caller, please ensure that your personal device is as well unmuted.
Thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
This is Caleb Brimhall of Platte River Power Authority. With the tariff language, will red lines of the pro forma agreements, all for sub-entity pro forma agreements, be essentially in conjunction with the tariff language, or are those going to be handled simultaneously?
Yeah, I can't totally speak for John Anders, our attorney who's working on this, but I believe his plan is to do the tariff language and the pro forma agreements concurrently in April.
Okay, thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions?
We have no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, well, thank you, everybody, for participating. We greatly appreciate it. We look forward to your comments on the draft final proposal April 9th. So enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Ethan, for your help.
Of course. That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.